Go ahead and edit to open up the function editor. And what I want to do is create an additional set of layers to take care of finer details and kind of keep those separate from the current function so that we can have both a larger scale set of detail and then finer details a little bit separate. So I'm just going to kind of move that over there, and what we're going to end up doing is adding the finer detail sections to this current function. Going in and creating too many modifications with different combiners will end up adding or creating problematic areas that we're not going to want. So I do want to have a kind of separated function that I can work on and then add it together after it's created. So what I'm going to end up doing is loading in combiner node, MetaNode on off, which is a MetaNode I've created. I'm going to go ahead and include that. That will be available with the training. So if we're using version 7, it's going to be a slider instead of a checkbox. Version 8 and up, it will be a checkbox. And if you're using version 5 or 6, and you want the same option, what you can do is create a blender node, set it to blend, and that's basically what this is. Input 0 and input 1, and then you can just go between 0 and 1 to switch between the on-off. This is going to allow me to switch between my fractals, and that way I can turn the details on or off so that I can look at that detail layer. So if you're using a version with a slider, it's just adjusting the slider to 0 or 1, depending on which input you use. So we want some smaller functions here. What we can do is just copy and paste this entire function over. You can also choose to modify if you want to have a separate vector transformation so that we can keep those vectors separated. What I'm going to do is copy all of this, Control C with it all selected, go over here to the right and paste it all in, and then so that I can modify the vectors once again all together, I'm going to copy that vector transform MetaNode that I created earlier. If you don't have the MetaNodes, you can just use all of the uncollapsed nodes, copy and paste to separate that. And then I'm going to connect the vectors. So that way I can still go in and modify every single origin if needed, or every vector, because there are some very useful things in there because of that. So go to our on-off. Right now there's going to be no difference because it's the exact same function. But what I want to do is reduce scales to create finer details. So we're going to turn this on, and we're going to go into the noises, and we need to create some smaller noises. Because I want to be able to do this a lot quicker, I'm going to modify this MetaNode and also replace all of these. So that's going to take a little bit of time, but I'll be able to make modifications a lot quicker. So what I can do is go to the smooth clip and the contrast, and we're going to publish the contrast to the small square and call it contrast. And then we're going to go to the smooth clip, publish the brightness as large square for the group, and this is going to be called size, and then publish that contrast under large square as contrast. So now we have more options available. And I'm going to go through and copy and paste these over and replace the current square filter with this one. We can also save it out, a new square filter. Depending on the complexity of the node, you usually suggest creating a new file and setting the old one to maybe a backup directory. I'm just going to overwrite this one because it wouldn't be very hard to recreate. And so I'll just go ahead and replace all of these. So now I can go through all of these and easily change these different settings. And even though I just went through and replaced all of these, there is another thing I want to show you. And right now we have 3 different outputs, the mix, the large, and the small. In order to connect those, we have to disconnect the current connection and reconnect it to choose the output. Well, if we want to create a more advanced metanode, that we can use checkboxes to choose our connection, or even sliders. For version 7 users, we'll need sliders. Version 8 and up, you'll be able to make a checkbox. Same way as basically we're just going to make a bunch of on-off switches internally within the metanode. So let's go ahead and do that to make this a little more efficient. So we've got right now the 3 outputs. What we want to do is, instead of having 3 separate outputs, we want one output that we can modify the value to pick what's going to be outputted. Since our current connection is connected to the large output and the small and mixed are not used in this one, I'm going to delete the small, delete the mixed, and just call this large one output. And connect that to the combiner. So what we want to do is be able to create switches to move between either the large section, the small section, or using the mix section. So what I want to do is, just to make it a little easier, we're going to have a default connection to the large with no checkboxes. So we're going to add in a combiner node, which is going to be set to Blender, and we're going to need 2 of these. So we can copy and we can paste another version. I do believe in version 7 or one of the earlier versions there was an issue at some point. So depending on whether or not you've updated to the current version, I would suggest changing anytime you copy and paste an identical node over, that you change the type of node and then change it back. What this will do is reset it just to really let view know that it is separate from the other one. Because with published parameters, there used to be an issue that would show up every once in a while that had duplicate parameters, and it would crash. So I'm pretty sure it's all fixed. If you're using current versions, it shouldn't be a problem. The current version of whatever release you're using. But just in case, if you run into that trouble, you might want to make sure you switch that over. So what we want to do is have a connection between the small and the large as a blender. And in order to make an on-off switch, all we need to do is add a constant node, a Boolean number. Now, if you're using version 7, you'll have to use this as a slider. You can just publish the slider and switch between 0 and 1 to make your on-off switch. But version 8 and higher, you can use the Boolean number to publish this checkbox. What this checkbox does is, by default, the number is -1, and we do need to bring in the correct output observer. So by default, without it checked, it's set to -1, which would be input 0, also making sure we clip the ratio 0 to 1. because we don't want that -1 output to modify it. We just want to cut it off. And if you check it, it sets it to 1, so that it automatically switches between 0 and 1 in the blender and creates an on-off switch. So this is our small to large. By default, it is set to small or the large features, so we are going to call this small. So if we want the features to become small, we can check small. Now, if we want to have the mix on, what we can do is first connect input 0 to this blender and connect our output to the blender and input 1 of the blender to the combiner. Add in constant node Boolean number. Also, if you're having that issue where it's copying over duplicate nodes and possibly crashing in earlier versions, if you're not up to date, if you right-click and add nodes in from the menu, it will not create a duplicate. And we're going to call this one mix. So what's going to happen is if we choose to mix, it's going to bypass and go to the combiner and give us the mixed output. If mix is not turned on, it's going to go through the 0 connection to this blender, which we get to pick whether or not we want the large or small output. Large by default, and checking it will give us small. So now we can publish. We can give this the group output, call this small features, or smaller features if you want. And then we can also publish this as mixed output, or just mixed. Click OK. Now we take a look at the node, and we can switch between small and large features or turn on the mixed variation very quickly, very easily. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out. It's a new filter. And I am going to give this a new name because it does have a built-in node that will be incompatible possibly with other versions. So in case I end up rebuilding this for previous versions of Vue earlier than version 8, so that you can open the files just to make everything clean. So I'm going to go back and replace all of these now. And then we can get started on customizing the smaller detail features. And there was one thing I forgot to mention, and that was with the checkboxes or using the blenders, make sure that the clip ratio is checked on for both of them. I did leave one of them unchecked. So just make sure that's turned on. It's also a good idea, since I've gone ahead and I have the exact same function for both of these, off and on, same thing. Since these other filters are not updated, what I'd like to do is just delete all of those, copy this over and paste it, and add this in as the left section, and that way I can still optimize and use all those other filters. So now we want to go through the detail layer, making sure that this is set to either on, or if you're using a blender, set it to 1, or whichever input you've got so you're looking at it. And we can go through and modify some of these settings. Well, to get some smaller features from the square samples, that's really easy because we don't even need to use the filter to modify its scale. So we can take the size and bring it down to 0.1. That's pretty easy. For the other one, we can bring the size to 0.2. And then for our other squares, we're going to go into the filter, and we can modify the outer size, or the large scale size, by making a negative amount provided it doesn't mess with that mixed function too much. We could choose to check on the mixed values, switch between smaller features or larger features. I think in this case I will end up going a little bit larger with it, and then taking the small square size, bringing it down to -2. And we could do a -3, and I'm just kind of working my way down, adjusting this and making finer details by doing this. We could switch this over to maybe a mixed layer. We can see some really nice fine lines showing up, and some bigger details coming in. And the nice thing about using these filters is we make sure that the details we're adding are still within those zones we currently have to prevent unwanted overlapping. And just kind of modify those a little. And then we can still go through the individual nodes if you did want to have some of them that are offset. It will, of course, add more detail overall. We can also modify whether or not we want to use this parabolic connection. I think I'll go ahead and just remove that parabolic from this one. So now if we go over to the on-off switch, we can take a look at the difference between these different sections and functions. So an entirely different look. Now we can replace this on-off switch with another combiner in order to fine-tune our combination of these detail sections, or we can leave the on-off switch where it is and kind of build it in so that we can easily turn that additional layer on or off if needed. One thing I did want to do is create even smaller details than what we currently have. I'm going to do that with these square stones. So I'm going to copy and paste this function, the fourth one in, paste it, and add that to this connection. So what we can do is add in another combiner. And connect it, and then I'm going to change the square size to 2. And this is going to give us very fine details everywhere. Change the wavelength, much smaller. Let's use 2 and 1. Lots of very fine details everywhere. I'm also going to go ahead and, as you can see, when I copied and pasted this, we lost the preview within the function, or the changes we were making. That is due to the way that the outputs we originally had were modified. So if I wanted to get this preview back when I'm using the square filter, I would need to go into, or basically rebuild the function. And now that we only have the one output, it would work properly. But the problem was the output that is used to preview has been deleted. So unfortunately, we've lost that because of the mixed option. I just wanted to keep the connections there because I was using the default of the large output. So I used the original large. I might be able to add that output mixed, or rename it mixed, and see if it comes back. But I'm pretty sure it's assigned by a node number that's internally built in. So probably have to rebuild it in order to get a preview, but that's alright because I know what these settings do. I am going to increase the contrast on these smaller features up to 8. And then when we go to the combiner, right now it's set to add. but we can choose where we want them to show up by using the minimum or maximum, or we can just blend it together. Depending on the way the smooth transitions are, it may not be the best solution. We could multiply it, but I think it's going to cause too much of an issue. So I'm going to go to Add and set this to 0.2, just to add very small details. And if you want to subtract this, remove it from maybe some of the larger buildings, we could mix this connection with one of these other ones. Also, that mixing ability we had before to connect to a different output is now gone because it's all controlled by the checkboxes. So technically, if you still want to have those other outputs available so that any additional connection or connector that you want to pull out of that noise is still an available option, you can go into the MetaNode and add new double outputs, or just never remove them in the first place, and just remember which output is controlled by the checkboxes, and then have the other outputs still available. So you could make a connection like this, where we could subtract from just the large area without having a problem if it's turned to mix. So we can go through, and if you want to make any additional changes and fine-tune anything, we could do that. I am going to turn some of these to the mixed mode, just because it does give us a much better look for finer details. And that's just being slightly added to it. But we still, this is just that detail layer. So let's also create a combiner to combine these two together. So we're going to add another combiner, and select both of these options. And we can just disconnect the other option so that that on-off switch goes between having nothing turned on, just a 0, or turned on. So that will affect the way the combiner works. Depending on your output, this is going to give us a connection of 0. So if you did want it to be a -1 or a 1 to return rather than a 0, you can add in a constant number and set that value to, say, -1 or 1, and make that the off switch. So if it's turned off, it's going to add 0, or add -1, add 1. So, different ways to customize that. Or you can add even more functions in. Lots you can do. Really a lot of ways to customize it. We're just trying to create something that is still going to be easily manageable. I mean, you can create very, very large functions, but the more complex it gets, the longer it's going to take to render and work with. So we're going to keep this a little minimal. Taking a look, we can go between the minimum and maximums and start to adjust offsets where we want the details to come in, which will automatically take those larger scale features and cut out what we don't need. Even at this point, multiply could be something that is very interesting. With large amplitudes, you can get some very extreme areas, some very complex functions. Then we can offset the way it multiplies. We could blend them. But for the most part, I really just want to add those detail elements at the moment. So we're going to add just these two together. We'll take that detail layer and set it to 0.5. Click OK. And there's just one last thing I want to do. in this function specifically to make the output a little bit better. Right now, a grayed out is the force extension amount, which is automatic at the moment and being set to 15, which means our output is going to be huge. And right now, by looking at the output node or the function node preview, I can see my extension is set to 11.9. We're way beyond the range of -1 to 1. And just to keep the materials that we're going to be controlling with this more usable and easier to set up, I am going to add in a map filter. So selecting a filter, adding it in as map, connecting that just before that output, and we're going to set the output range to -1 to 1, and we need to fine-tune the input range to be part of or whatever it is that's going in. So it looks like it's going up to around 10, maybe even up to 11, and then around -2 is the minimum. You can scale in and out just to make sure that's going to work correctly. It does look like maybe it is going up to 11 on the y-axis, so we will take the map upper value, set it to 11.9, and take that negative value and set it to, starting with a -2, maybe -2.5, let's try -3, and we just want to get it to a point where our extension, our automatic extension, is going to be 1. So let's take that upper value, set it to 12, so it looks like -3 as the lower value and 12 as the upper for the input range is going to give us a nice transition over to -1 to 1. So now that is all nice and uniform. So we can scale this up to get our larger buildings. Now it may end up, our size right now is still kind of small, so I'm going to increase the scale of the terrain to a kilometer by a kilometer, and then we can adjust the height manually with the gizmo or type it in. I'm going to go ahead and save this out. It's version 6. And then render it so you can see how it looks. So we can see that detail layer added a whole bunch of little details everywhere, little objects, and lots of extra geometry to really make it more complex. And overall, it's looking pretty good, even with its lack of a material. There is only going to be one problem at the moment, and that is around the edges. If you take a look at the edge, we're going to have some areas that are raised up. And if it's pretty flat, it's not going to be a problem because it will render some geometry there. And I'll let this finish rendering really quick. And for the most part, I mean, that could work as an edge from farther away. The problem is when your edge is right at the end of one of the buildings, one of the squares and one of the objects. So what will happen is you're going to get this very thin spike or thin amount of geometry. And you can see a little bit over here on the end. And if, say, the edge was this taller building or taller section, what would happen is you would just have this huge, flat, extruded polygon that's going to look terrible. So what we can do is subtract our edges. Now we can't use the 0 edges that's built in to the terrain editor because that is a rounding effect that is meant for leveling out the edges of the terrain, although this does in some cases work to create something that's pretty cool looking, and I have used it for a couple of scenes. It gives a nice transition from the inside to the outside. It will round everything out, and does level out those bottom parts. So it's definitely acceptable if you want to create a more of a circular transition to smaller to large buildings and subtract things that way. But if you just want to cut off that edge and not have that transition, what we need to do is create one more connection and one more combiner to subtract and cut it out. So we'll take a look at this really quick, and then we'll hop over to the function editor and finish that up. So this doesn't look too bad. You do lose a lot of detail around the edges, but it does work overall for leveling things out, and is definitely an option to use to create sort of a city center or a different blocked area. Because, of course, copying and pasting these over and creating variations of the same terrain just by modifying the origin is definitely an option. But what we want is an even cutout of the edge, or kind of a flattening just on the outer edges to keep everything else pretty much the same. Now, the biggest thing is getting our scale to be equal to 1, which I think is going to be easier to work with. But since right now we had it reduced within the altitude reduction, we do need to modify this overall in the function. And luckily we have a single connection that will modify everything, which is this vector right here. The easiest way to modify that, in our vector transform, we're going to go to Edit, and I'm going to add in just before we could extract the matrix transformation for this and increase our size for our lines, or we can use a more simplistic node under MetaNodes vector operation XYZ product. We're going to add that to our chain and publish it as vector size and if we increase our scale and the sizes of our vectors, we can completely modify the entire scale of everything within the function. That can also be done independently through any of the vector links, but this was the main reason why I wanted to have everything controllable within this one node, so that I can modify a scale easily, I can cut out an axis, I can rotate it. Anything that you can modify with the MetaNodes and the vector operations, anything that will connect to a vector, this way we can modify everything if we need to. Just makes it a little bit easier. So now our overall scale set to 1 is the same, around the same as it was before. We will just need to modify the height. Might be a little smaller, or give us more detail overall. But now the size is correct within there, so that we can see the noise we're about to use correctly. So before, the first square that we used, that one that was confined to the edges, was set to 50. Now we can see that that is no longer and is not covering the outer edges. And the previews are updated, which is really nice. What we need to do is multiply this by that single square option. And what we're going to do is add in a blender. And I can select that square pattern, that square noise, click off to get that little red box, add in another noise, which is going to connect itself to the original position up on top, which is what I want, because now I have that exact size that I need. We'll go ahead and use the square filter, and this does say version 0.3, even though it is the 0.4 version. We'll add that. And connect it. We are going to just keep it at the default value, which was the large square, so we want to modify the large square to match up the edges. So we're going to set a higher contrast because right now it's just way too low. We want to cut this off pretty good, but not too much where it's going to spike out on us. And then we can adjust that size to get it to go to the outer edge. And now there's only one adjustment we need to do. There should only be one adjustment, which is to make sure that that minimum point is 0. Right now it's -1. We have a map node built into this, but that is per object. And let's see. So that is for the large area of the map. We could set that lower value from -1 to 0. And that way our output is 1 to 0. If you don't have the MetaNodes, you can just add a map filter, making sure that the bottom line is on 0. So that way, when we go to the blender and set it to multiply, move it all the way over, it is going to multiply it and flatten the area out. Now, because of the height and the elevation, it looks like we also need to raise up the current terrain, or the current function, and then drop it back down. So what I'm also going to do is add in a filter, set it to offset, add it to our connection of the entire function, and we just offset it until the outer edge is flattened, which it looks like it did correctly. And then we may need to remap it afterwards because we just raised it all up, and we're going to need to drop it back down by 1. So we can go to the offset, add that link, add another filter, and make the offset -1 at the end. So now our output should be -1 to 1. It looks like there is a little bit that is going over. So we may need to, we can map it a little bit more. It looks like one of the areas is going up above 1. I don't think that's going to make a huge difference. So I'm not going to add another map node, but if you needed to, looks like it is working okay. So now the outer edges are clipped. We can take a look at that. So we have this smooth subtraction around the edge, this gradient dropping down. To adjust that, if you want it to be sharper, you can increase the contrast and increase the brightness of that smooth clipped filter, or you just use that MetaNode. In order to fine-tune it, you can add another filter to it if you want to clip it even more, or if you want to increase the range, you can decrease the contrast, you can increase that gradient. I'm going to leave it open just a little, so I like it the way it is right now, because this will definitely allow me to avoid just having an edge, the fine edge of a building, say this taller one over here, because if we were to just cut it out very sharply, we would have a big kind of spiky area sticking out. So this will prevent that from happening. And for the most part, we're going to be within the center of the terrain and not on the edge. Just make sure that if we do move around the edge or start to combine these together with other terrains, that they're not going to have that really sharp cutoff, and that we always make sure that it is going to look correct. So we'll go ahead and save this out. And with that outer edge being subtracted, this also becomes pretty nice for creating single buildings. Since the outer clip is linked to a separate position, we can go ahead and reduce our size to pull out the details of the one function and still subtract, but now we can extrude this and create a single building with nice rounded edges. So this is basically a building generator. The size of the building is just controlled by the size of that XYZ. And then if you want, you can also use the clipping available that's shown in the color map to adjust the minimum amount. So we can clip out and cut the edges, which is pretty cool. And if you want to have some sort of randomization for creating different buildings, well, one thing we can do is go back into that vector transform MetaNode, and where we have this offset, we can publish our offset. So we're going to publish it as randomize, call it offset, click OK, OK again, and now we can type in different vectors and create an entirely different building. So now we have something new we can work with. You can also take advantage of the new nodes that were added to version 8. If we go to constant node, we do have a random constant number. We can set a range between the minimum and a maximum amount. Now this is a number and not a vector. So if we wanted to control the offset, as I was showing before, we could break down a vector with the decomposer. Well, we can also create a vector with the composer. So add a math node, composer 3, and connect that to that random constant. You could set up, anytime we hit reset, it's going to select a value between these min and max values. So I'm going to create a maximum value of 2000 and a minimum value of 2000. So if I click, it looks like it's only letting me go to 100 at the moment, although my output is showing 2000, so maybe there's a problem right now. Either way, we can click reset and it'll output a number between the min and max. One way to compensate for that, if that is not just a display error, is to add a multiplier on the filter. You could even add a multiply. Let's go ahead and multiply it by 2 on one of the connections and reconnect it to that random constant. And then for that last connection, I'm going to add a filter and offset it by, let's say, 150. So that way it's going to return a separate number for each vector, and then we can connect our offset to this composer, go to our random constant, and anytime we hit reset, it'll generate us a new building. So that way we can create a pretty cool building generator with kind of a seed where we can just reset it and see which buildings we want to pick out if you want to create those individually using this type of setup. A lot of control that way, and ends up being a pretty cool solution for any sort of sci-fi creations. But I mean, depending on the way you have textures built and also the way you planned out your buildings, you could obviously use this for more than just science fiction. Just science fiction I'm using because it gives you a little more leeway without having to be so precise about placements of everything. This randomization is also going to work for the larger scale scene. for the overall terrain, so it can still be useful for the offset. Because the way the Z is modified, I did see kind of an inverted function before. So if you want to remove the Z offset, you can just disconnect it from the composer. And that way it will look the same, because extreme values have an interesting effect on noises, especially fractals, where you lose quality if the vector's too high, because you're going outside of the range where the detail is being created. They say it's infinite, but when the vector offset is way too high, it doesn't have roughness values or details anymore. That's just one of the things that happens. Usually it's not a problem. Just in this kind of a case, it ends up being an issue. So if you just want to do the X and Y, it'll keep your shapes about the same. But if you really want randomization, then you can connect that Z to the composer, and it'll really adjust different layers. And I've just really quickly set up basically an on-off switch for this offset, where I have a constant vector of just 0, so a constant node set to constant vector 0 crossed, connected to a blender, clip the ratio 0 to 1, and then that's connected to the random with a Boolean number that we can turn on and off. So that way we can turn that offset on or off if we wanted to. What we can also do is connect all of these, create a metanode, so we can extract the reset and the on-off. So we can randomize it very easily, and then also turn it on or off. We could also have something switch between the building, the XYZ scale, where we have the larger scale, or the scale that works better for creating the individual buildings. So you could have a generator that can be used for either or, and you could switch between it very easily. Okay, so this is our function currently, and I think it's about time we start adding some materials. So next we're going to take a look at modifying, creating materials using the function we use to create this, so that we have nice matches on the objects or the geometry to create the variations to match a little bit better. Also being able to use that filter and modify it to create some variations, maybe smoother areas. And then also using some additional layers to pick up on the slope elements or altitudes to really create and make this come to life.